Do you like automation? Do you like automating lots of machines all at once? Do you like automating them with lenses, with programmed circuits? This is a thread in the GregTech New Horizons official Discord server. Um, Samsa posted about this the first time. This is the setup they suggested. Uses stocking auto pull hatches. Then it looks very complicated. And there are lots of other pictures. They looked very complicated too. I posted this not long after. This looks very complicated. I use I/O ports instead, and it's faster. But what does it do? There's another picture, and there's another picture. There's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of moving parts, and in GTNH, no one's really made a video tutorial of how to do what's called parallel non-consumable, where you have a configured circuit going into a machine. How do you take the configured circuit out after the machine's done? There's a lot of ways to do it, and I'm going to talk about some of those ways. I'm going to show pros and cons, and I'm going to show a demo. I'm going to show how to build it. I'm also going to show what I did in single player. So there are 4 kinds of parallel non-consumable endpoints and 2 kinds of self-shufflers, and you can use them in almost any combination. These can be used with multi-block machines and single-block machines. So the only method that's been discussed by other people on the GTNH Discord that I've seen has been the advanced stocking bus option. And it used to be better before the stocking buses got nerfed, but the stocking buses got nerfed, which makes the approach a lot more difficult because you can only use it at the very end game. But I'm going to talk about 3 other approaches for the endpoints and one other approach for the self-shuffler that I haven't seen discussion of. So Samsa's approach uses advanced stocking bus with pre-filled cells that already contain the non-consumable. I'm going to talk about setups which have cell pools which don't, and they get filled as requests are made. And I'm going to talk about different endpoints which can be used with single blocks because the advanced stocking bus can't be used with single block machines. So for the endpoints, the stocking bus is simple to make. Although the diagram looks a bit complicated, overall, it's much simpler than the alternative. You only need item conduits and filters and the stocking bus itself and the stocking hatch. But the drawback is you need UEV to automate fluids this way, and LUV to automate items. So for a lot of machines, they only use items. It's doable in LUV, but getting from EV when you unlock applied logistics to LUV, you've got to go insane voltage. You've got to get assembly line. You've got to have assembly line automation. You've got to have plat line. You might have to do monoline for samarium. There's a few steps involved, so you're missing out on it. It would be beneficial to have it sooner. And ultimately, even when you do get it, it's actually worse performance in terms of throughput. So every 5 seconds, a stocking bus or a stocking hatch that sets auto pull will look at inventories to see if it can pull. This is to reduce TPS costs, but there's no way to override it. So you're adding 2.5 seconds every time you switch a recipe, which is actually an avoidable cost. So with the IO port endpoint, which I've designed, it's buildable at EV. As soon as you look applied logistics, it has the best switching time. So the switching time that I get with my design is 7 ticks. So there's 7 ticks between an LCR doing one recipe. Let's say it does carbon monoxide with the config 1 circuit, and then 7 ticks later, it can do a config 2 circuit recipe. It can do a config 3 circuit. It can do a different recipe. It can switch from carbon monoxide to carbon dioxide. It can do any chemistry recipe. Just for example, it can do fluid-only recipes as well. So the stocking bus approach struggles with fluid-only recipes as well. And it is the most complex approach, which is why I'm making this video about it, because I don't think people know how to build it, and I'd like people to know. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. I think it's a very interesting problem. So in addition to that, there's a third approach, using toggle buses. So this approach, it's arguably the worst of both, because it has even worse switching time than the stocking auto pull hatches and buses, but you can improve it if you make a lot of tweaks, but then making those tweaks reduces the stability. This is by far the most complicated because I only use it for one reason, which is you can use toggle buses with single block machines. This is the only approach that works with single block machines, and it's also buildable in just EV. So in addition to that, you can have two kinds of cell shufflers. You can have pre-filled cells or unfilled cells with the cell filler. And you still probably want to make a cell filler a manual one for pre-filled cells, just so you can like press a button to request a craft. Let's say I want to request 10 cells that contain a config1 circuit, rather than manually inserting the 10 circuits, because this is set up that in the late game and maybe even in the mid game, you might build a lot of. And so that's a big time saver, even if you go with pre-filled cells. Overall, pre-filled cells, I think, is the better approach. You need less parts, so it's less titanium, less overall passive energy costs on your AA2 network, and it is more reliable, because it's harder to separate the circuit, the integrated circuit, for the IC2, for carbon dioxide. It's hard for it to get lost. It's hard for it to get separated. It can still break, but it's more stable. With the cell filler, with unfilled cells, the idea is you have one big buffer that stores storage cells, and it just fills the cells as they are needed by different configured circuit crafts. So the main advantage is if you use a cell, unfilled cells, you can fill them, and you can extract them and insert them. It's a lot easier to do it faster, because the pre-filled cells, generally the only way to reinsert them is, you can use other methods, but the most practical method is with item conduits. And if you're using the item conduits, then it's kind of slow. But on the other hand, if you use unfilled cells, you need more infrastructure, you need more IO ports, and it's also it's easier to mess up if you make a mistake. Then the non-consumable, it's hard to get in the right place. If you don't have enough non-consumables, it's difficult to do that calculation as well. So what we have here is a machine that's pulling CO2 cells and CO cells. So these cells contain the ingredients to make carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide. So if I take one of these, and so we can see this one has a config 2 circuit and 2 oxygen, and this one has a config 1 circuit and 1 oxygen. And they're getting fed into a large chemical reactor that is alternating between the two. And what's happening is the cells are getting inserted into this baby chest. They get pulled into an IO port. The IO port deposits the non-consumable into this input bus, the consumable into this input bus, which is the carbon, so the circuit doesn't get eaten, and it puts the fluid into this quadruple input hatch, which doesn't have to be quadruple for this recipe, and so what's happening is the fluid and item go inside the bus and hatch. That triggers a machine controller cover, which turns it on as soon as the detector covers find the item. And as soon as the machine turns off, a signal is sent to this NOT gate. And this circuit, what this circuit does is, if something is not crafting, every few ticks, every 7 ticks, it will try and pull a new cell using an item importer from the baby chest. And it pulls it into the IO ports. There is this small interface storage bus subnet, which acts as a 1-tick buffer. So in effect, it pulls every 7 ticks, but it takes 1 extra tick to actually go in the chest. So it's actually every 8 ticks. Then it goes into the IO port, and the cell takes out, and it activates this block update detector. Normally, if you put a comparator next to an IO port, the IO port will not trigger a redstone comparator signal update, because it doesn't block update itself, which is a bug. But if you put the block update detector next to it, the advanced one, then you can use this. And you also have to screwdriver it so that it doesn't send redstone to another component if you don't want it to. So after the recipe is finished crafting, then the cell sends to an IO port down here. And this IO port extracts all the contents, and it sends the cell back over to this purple subnet. So every time the cell crafts, the cell gets emptied along with the contents. Now, you don't have to empty the non-consumable. These circuits are getting emptied, but you don't have to. So with this setup, you can do you can run them in parallel. That's the important thing. So if you copy this one slice, you make more slices, you have more chemical reactors. And the important thing about this is the switching time is really low. So if you use auto pull stocking buses, these two, this one is LUV and this one is UEV. So if you want to run a chem reactor, you need UEV to do this, which is very late game. And if you want to do it with other machines, you can do it LUV, which is more doable, but it's actually slower because those things only have a poll rate of 5 seconds. The auto pull only updates every 5 seconds. So on average, you're getting 2.5 second delay on the pull, which artificially limits the number of recipes you can do. And with this one, if there is one cell that's finished crafting, and let's say I've got a recipe that's very expensive, like ammonia, and ammonia is crafting and it's taking like a few seconds, then while all the input buses are empty, we can actually pull another cell in. And so there's actually, if you have a long-running recipe, there is an instant switch. There's no delay, and we have full uptime. So I'm going to show how to build this with my friend Cray. And where's Cray? There you are. So we're gonna build it over here, and my inventory's got a bunch of stuff, but we're gonna just yeah, we're gonna build this from scratch. So but let's start with the reactor. So this integrated circuit, I should show the design. It's pretty simple. I've got output, 2 outputs vertically, and then 2 inputs horizontally. And if you want, you can test them as well. You can press the little buttons. So the idea for the circuit, I actually place it upside down here, but it's a pretty simple IC. It's not like a 10 component, 20 component. So the logic is it's sending a pulse up here whenever there's not a pulse, whenever this NOT gate. The reason why we have the NOT gate outside of the IC is because the IC doesn't update itself. So if you place down the IC, it's not going to start the clock until it gets a signal externally, which is why I have the NOT gate separate. But technically, you could put the NOT gate inside the IC as well. And there's a lot of ways you can lay this out. So this is one layout that I designed that was width 2. So if you really want, you can wall share your LCRs. You can wall share the whole thing because it only fits in 2 blocks, which you'd probably have to be crazy to do, because these inert casings are very cheap in comparison to the components here. But there's a separate IC design that I made for this. So this design, this one makes high octane gasoline. And what I've got here is, I don't have the distillation towers on universal, but I do have the LCRs and the cracking units. And so the important thing is this works for fluid only recipes as well. And because we're using the IO port to deposit items, there's no delay in depositing the items. It pretty much always happens in 1 tick. And if it doesn't happen in 1 tick, then it still works. And this works even for 1 tick recipes. So it's still a good idea to scale up the pattern sizes, but you don't have to. And so this one, a cracker only takes some oil and steam, and in this case we've got like steam and hydrogen getting routed to the middle input hatch. The bottom input hatch gets the other fluid, which is set with an inverter card, and all the non-consumables get set to the input bus, and then they need to be extracted as well. So this design relies on the property of the input bus that you can just pull the items out with the storage bus and an IO port. Previously, there were a lot of designs where you had to break the input bus using an annihilation plane, but you don't have to do it with this setup. So this is a bit of a different design. I have the NOT gate pointing differently because it's trying to get only the fluid hatch, because I don't care about this hatch. And I know that this hatch is always going to have the same amount matching the pattern. So I only need to check one hatch. And then like the IC itself, it's pointing down instead, so it's rotated the different way. So this is a flexible design. This is just another approach that this design shows all the circuitry at the front. So this one's a bit easier to debug if you don't get it right the first time, which it took a bit of trial and error. But yeah, so there's a lot of different ways you can lay out the parts. I'm just going to show one of the ways, but yeah, so let's go build setup here. So we'll just start with the chem reactor. So it's a good idea to use the quadruple input hatch, but you do have to make sure that your pattern size, because the fluid packets, when they get decoded in the fluid packet decoder, if you have a fluid packet that contains 64 buckets, it might not fit in the hatch because the decoder needs to act on the whole thing at once. So with the EVTR, the idea of this is that you can build an EV, and this input hatch, it only has 32 buckets per slot, and you can't stack multiple slots with the same fluid automatically. You can do it manually, but not with an automatic insertion. So you need to make sure your pattern's not over 32 buckets if you're using this one. And there are some patterns, like for PBI, you need, there's a 64 bucket batch recipe that you do and upgrade these input hatches. You can technically use it with without the quad hatches. You can use single hatches, which mitigates the problem a bit. But then you have more components because the storage bus, the fluid storage bus, that's the really expensive part of this setup, because you need 1, 2, 3 storage buses, 1 fluid storage bus, 2 IO ports. The item importers are cheap. The block update detects is cheap, and the fluid packet decoder, and a storage bus for the baby chest as well. So you need a few storage buses and a few IO ports. That's the main cost of the setup, but this is very doable in EV, and Cray and I have been doing it in Iron as well. So yeah, let's build this reactor. Oh yeah, there's a bug with multi-parts. So sometimes you get this where the multi-parts kind of glitching out. It's not perfect, but in principle you can always fit Project Red and AE parts in the same multi-part. Sometimes if you have like a facade and it's next to a red alloy wire, sometimes they glitch out a bit like this, but it's purely a visual bug. You can see the network's still connected to the storage bus, and it's still receiving the fluid as well. Although yeah, it can help to break and replace when that happens. So the fluid packet decoder's getting deposited the fluid packets with the storage bus from the IO port rather than an export bus. So the export bus only works like every second or so, but the storage bus is pushing 1 packet every tick. So in principle, if you have 4 input fluids, it'll take 4 ticks to deposit them all, assuming the hatch can fit them all. So I've just built all the physical components. I haven't done any configuring. So it's just a replica from what I built before. And so I haven't touched anything, but the first thing we want to do is we want to screwdriver this block update detector is getting triggered by the red alloy wire. It's not very smart. So we just want it to point somewhere different, because we don't actually care about the redstone signal from this thing. We only want it to update the IO ports to cause the block update for the comparator, which sends a signal into the IC gate. So the first thing we want to do is that, and then we want to make sure these storage buses are configured. So we want all the fluids to go inside the fluid packet decoder. We want all the non-consumables to go inside the storage bus, and we want all the fluids are going to be routed to this one from the fluid packet decoder. So we don't need a filter on the fluid storage bus here. None of these are going to use priorities. And this one, yeah, so we want the non-consumables to go in this one, which doesn't have the one that doesn't have the item detector cover. And we want to leave these configs default, and the default config is just going to send a signal if it contains any items or any fluids. And with the red LAY, the signal strength is always going to be enough to turn on the LCR. So we want to add the machine controller cover. I want to leave the default config on this too. So this is going on the side. And for the outputs, we want to add, so this is an output bus and 4 output hatches. Usually I need 3. And I've just got some stainless steel pipe, but you can add more dual interfaces if the output is buffering too slow. And then over here we've got a output net. So this one's just got some fluid storage and item storage that'll give us items. And the cells, once they're done, they're going to end up in this IO port. And they're going to get extracted. They're going to get extracted through this item conduit into this chest. So we can have a look at the item contents later. Yeah, so the IO ports, the first one is going to be depositing items into the network. And it's only going to move the cell to the output slot once the work is done. So this is a default config. That's the first one. Then the second one, once the recipe is done, we want it to take the items, the non-consumable, from network storage into the cell. And once it's done that, it moves to the output slot, which means when work is done. Now, the IO port is a bit interesting in that if you have a cell in this config and the cell's in the output slot and there's another item that shows up in the network storage, it will get added to the cell in the output slot. So it's important that we take the cell out of the output slot as soon as possible. Now in this test case, this chest is always going to have capacity to pull the output slot out immediately. But in other cases, you might, in real world, you might have cells which are getting pushed and pulled very quickly, and there might not be capacity to return them immediately back. So in a case like that, all we need to do is add like a hopper at the bottom and then extract from the hopper instead. But for the test case, we don't need to do that. So for the fluid storage bus, the way that we have all the fluids going here is we search in A for fluid packets, and it says invalid fluid, and that's okay. So we add it to bookmarks, and I'll add a new bookmark page. And we just drag it into the storage bus, and this won't work on its own. We also need a fuzzy card. So we just add the fuzzy card in, and now it'll work. We don't need to change the comparison. Now for the item storage bus for the non-consumable, I've already set it to a few different circuits, and I'll just copy that config from here. But yeah, in your survival world, you're just gonna ghost in the circuits, and you might have a lot of them. I'll show the picture for we have a setup for this in practice in our survival worlds, and we have a lot more circuits than this, but you shouldn't need any capacity cards. I think this is enough slots for every recipe in an LCR. So did I save the settings, and then we'll just copy them onto both the storage buses, and we can see that's done. And we also want to add the fluid packets to this one, the one with the non-consumable. We want to add it. To the one without non-consumable. So what this is saying is, with an inverter card, it's saying that send everything that isn't a fluid packet or the program circuit into this. So that's all the cards done for the storage buses, and I think that's it. So Cray's just made explanation of a general idea of what's going on with the system. It's like a high-level explanation. So what we're going to have is we're going to have a main network, and this is going to be the orange one. And we're going to put the patterns. So we want to make the carbon dioxide. We put the pattern in here, and we want to make the carbon monoxide. We put the pattern in here. And so that's going to have blocking mode on, and like this, it's not going to be directly on the drive, but the idea is we're going to have one drive for every circuit. And in some cases, we might combine them if we know there's no conflicts. And these drives are going to be either contain cells which have the circuit in them, and config 0 just means no circuit. So I guess if it's dioxide, then it would be 2. And so each drive contains either it doesn't contain a circuit, and we fill it with the circuit later, or it already contains the circuit. So this is pre-filled versus unfilled. And then once we have that cell, it's filled with the circuit and the item. So let's say that happens like in this third step. And then once we have the cell with all the parts it needs to craft, it gets sent to the endpoints. So the endpoints is the machine, and there's like every machine has some like machinery, some parts that move the contents of the cell into the machine and then take out the non-consumable once it's done. So there's a few different ways to make the endpoints. There's a few different ways to do these drives. You can do them pre-filled or unfilled. And there's a few different ways to shuffle these cells, this bit here. So you know, this is, I've done a lot of different approaches like this. This is just a high level overview. So this endpoint here, all this one does is the endpoint. So it doesn't shuffle the cells. What it expects is it expects a cell, and the cell contains the circuit, and it contains the components. So it contains the carbon dust, it contains the oxygen gas, and it contains a config2 circuit for carbon dioxide. So if I put, do you have an energy? Yeah, we've got EV energy hatch, and we've got an amp of EV. And the machine is currently off because of the machine control cover. So we've finished configuring this setup, and now I've got some pre-filled cells with carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide ready to craft. And if I put them inside this baby chest, we'll see the LCR turns on for a very brief period, and the cell is deposited in here. And the item inside this, it's the, if I get a ME chest, the item inside the cell is just the non-consumable. So you could extract it out by putting the cell into an iPod, or you could just send it back into a pre-filled drive. But this is the endpoint. So this is the iPod endpoint, and I think I'm the only person to have used this. So this is only one part of the picture. This system works with the drive pre-filler or the unfiller, and you also need to push the patterns. So it's not a full example. It's a full example of the endpoints. But now I'm going to show you a full example, which is over here. So this setup, this is a fully self-contained example. What this setup does is it takes in some raw fluids. So it takes in oxygen, heavy oil, hydrogen, steam, nitrogen, carbon, and it makes high octane gasoline. And it does this using level maintainers. These level maintainers are doing a few things. So they have high octane gasoline ready to craft, and they're crafted using patterns. So over here is where all the patterns are stored on the main network. So the main network is pink. And the main network says, oh, if I want to make, let's have a look at one of these patterns. Pattern terminals here. I want to make some methanol. I need some carbon monoxide and hydrogen. And I don't put the program circuit in here. And methanol needs a config1 circuit. So we're going to put it back. And this row is the config1 row. So each row here is a different config circuit. So this one is 24 and calcium. This row is an oil cracker for number 1. This row is an oil cracker for number 2, oil cracker for number 3, and last one is LCRs, and we're going to use a number 4 config. And each of these has a different set of patterns with it. So what this does, this is an unfilled setup. So these cells in the buffer, these are all empty. And what happens when I push the craft goes inside a normal ME interface. This ME interface has an advanced blocking card, and this mode doesn't actually matter because the cell's empty. And this interface on the mainnet, on the pink net side, also has blocking mode on. This one doesn't need blocking mode. So the contents of the cell gets moved into the drive, and then the drive contains an item. And what I have here is a transfer node. So a transfer node can pull with the filter that respects MBT, and it can pull every tick. So an item conduit pulls twice a second roughly, and it can use the filter. You can also do it with the transfer node. The transfer node is faster, but it is a bit more expensive. So in this case, I've only got 4 speed upgrades. I think you need 10 or 20 to get every tick. I'm not sure exactly, but with 4 speed upgrades, I think it's already around the same speed of an item conduit. And then I have an item filter, And this item filter is inverted and it contains the empty cells. So anything which isn't an empty cell, that's what this thing does. Anything that isn't an empty cell takes from the drive and moves it into this IO port. Now this IO port, what's this one do? So it says move to output when work is done, and it moves network storage into the cell. Well, if I look behind here, this IO port is on a subnet, and it's on a yellow subnet, and it has a storage bus on this interface, and this interface is in stocking mode. And this stocking mode interface contains one set of the non-consumables, because it turns out if you set it up correctly, an interface can stock and restock every tick. So you can extract, an IO port only processes one cell in any given tick. So if you put one cell in one tick, it will spend one tick exactly to move the entire network storage, which is one config circuit and one calcite or into the cell, and then it will push the cell out because I need to take the cell out straight away, and then it can do another cell the next tick because this interface is that fast at the stocking. And if the interface is not stocking every tick, then you have a problem with your ME system. So this cell, it now contains the config 24 circuit. And that config 24 circuit cell that gets pulled by this translocator, it's just a visual indicator. This translocator takes the cell into here. These translocators aren't the best for TPS if you spam them and they're moving a lot of items. So you want to use something else, but this is just for a demo setup to see that the cells are actually moving. And in this case, the cells are moving into a buffer chest. And then this buffer chest pulls those cells into this interface. And if I take out my network visualization tool, this blue subnet is connected to the LCRs, and it's got a wireless connector. And this wireless connector is connected to all the storage buses. And then after the storage buses, the cell goes into one of these baby chests. And the idea by pushing the cell into this subnet with the storage buses is I can push as many cells as I want, and these baby chests will always instantly fill. With an item conduit, I can only push, every 10 ticks or so. But these ones, they're very fast. So the bottleneck becomes the endpoint setup. The bottleneck is not the shuffling speed with this design. If you use item conduits, the bottleneck for cycling the crafts can become the cell shuffling. So each row of this setup does exactly the same thing. It's just shifted off by one, so that the subnets don't share channels. Because if I put two drives next to each other, they'll become the same subnet. But if I right-click this drive subnet, it's only got two channels. One is for the interface connected to the mainnet, what's facing the mainnet, and the other one is for the drive. And so after the cell is pushed from the storage bus into the baby chest, then we'll have the endpoint that I showed earlier. So the item importer will pull it into the IO ports. That will shut off the item importer according to the IC gates. Then the IO port will push the contents of the cell into the network storage on this light blue subnet, which will send the items into the input hatch, the input bus. So these two are for the consumable items, and the input bus in the middle is for the non-consumable items. So then after it's crafted, this is the full process right from the beginning from the mainnet. After it's crafted, the cell is taken out from the same IO port. This is pulled with an item conduit because the speed is not that important because I have a buffer here. And this black subnet, this one sends me all the way back. And this one stores all the cells that have now been emptied. Well, they're not empty yet, but it stores them in this interface. And it stores them in this IO port. This IO port dumps all of the non-consumables inside the cell into the red subnet, which stocks the non-consumable. So the red subnet contains all the non-consumables. It contains a set of, and some junk fluids, which is my mistake. But after the cell has emptied the non-consumable into the red subnet, then the cell goes into the brown subnet. And the brown subnet just contains a lot of empty cells. And the brown subnet, it has this setup here where I have a stocking mode interface, and I have an item conduit extracting from that interface, and it sets into the ME drives. And you can replace this with a translocator or a GregTech pipe with a fast conveyor, or even use a transfer node. You can use a lot of different things. And this is just one example of how to restock the cells, and then that's the full cycle. So after that brown net has pushed the empty cells back in the drive, we are back where we started. So I'll turn it on by requesting a craft for high octane gasoline. Let's say 100,000. And we see instantly these cells empty, and they go inside the buffer chest. Well, actually they travel so fast, the LCRs already started processing, and so did the distillation tower and the cracking. And if I click on one of these, we'll see, oh, this one's crafting ethanol, and then it switched straight away to nitrous oxide, then acetone. Any craft that is longer than 13 ticks, there will be no gap between recipe switches. So anti-knock agent, that's 5 seconds, but there's a case where there may be a gap even if the recipe time is over 13 ticks, if the input depends on the output from the previous recipe, because that actually needs to get sent back into network storage for the pink nets to actually push the craft, which is why we sometimes see a bit of a delay here. But now I think all these LCRs are done and all the crackers are done. And hey, look, we finished the high octane gasoline craft, just like that. So the crackers had the same setup as the LCRs, except they don't have an input bus for the item because they only use fluid-only recipes. And the distillation tower, you can do universal DT because you can insert into the input bus a config circuit instead of ghosting it in. I just didn't do it for this setup because I'm just showing that you can do it for the oil cracker, but in practice, it would probably be better to, because DAC is very fast. So, you know, the main cost of doing universal is you need the full length for the tower, and that's not much stainless steel cost. The DAC itself is very expensive, but the stainless steel is pretty cheap. So I just showed as an example, like you'd have, these ones have a recipe, these will have a ME dual interface, they're all sharing parallel, but they're not using non-consumables, and they're just doing, these ones are doing toluene, naphtha, and sulfuric light fuel. And this one, I think, is octane, butene, and some proxy recipes. So that's the full setup for the auto crafting. And if I just want to craft high octane gasoline on demand, then, you know, I can just put it in the level maintainer. But let's say if I craft some high octane gasoline and I distill some oil, I end up with heavy fuel, light fuel, naphtha, and refinery gas. And I want to recycle the parts that I don't use. Let's say I end up with a lot of refinery gas. I want to recycle that. Now, there's a few different ways you can do this. One way is you could have like a passive stock. So let's say I have some heavy oil, heavy fuel, which is spare, and I want to crack it back into components. I could have a separate distillation tower and a separate oil cracker, which does that for me. Or I could have that patterned as well, and I could put that pattern in the network to craft. But the problem if I do that is if I put the cracking pattern for different sources of heavy oil, let's say the heavy fuel I want to distill into toluene, and I've got a pattern that already distills light fuel into toluene, then if I have two patterns which do the same thing, the network will get a bit confused when it automates the craft. So the solution to this is we don't want to pattern the output in the recipe. But what we do want is for the network to eventually just, you know, it needs to insert the configured circuits into these machines for them to work. So I do need to pattern the craft, but I don't need to pattern the output. And that's where we use proxy crafts for this. So this level maintainer, it has some PX or proxy crafts. And this, what does this do? So if I have a look at one of these patterns, this pattern takes in some hydrocracked light fuel and it produces a proxy item. It doesn't produce any oil. And the way that we have this set up is this proxy craft is going to be requested by the level maintainer, and it needs to be completed. So the way we complete it is we actually have the proxy items here. They're just renamed paper pieces. And what we have is we have a timer here. And this timer, what this says is every 64 ticks, we're going to move all the proxy items from this chest into this chest. And then every 64 ticks, we're going to move proxy items from this chest into network storage, which is going to go back into the storage bus, which has a fuzzy card, high priority, and takes the proxy item. And it is insert only. So when an item is inserted into network storage, the first priority is it will get returned to complete a craft. If it completes a craft, then it will return to network storage. And there are 3 places you can put network storage in applied logistics. One is digitized. You can put it inside cells. The next one is storage bus. You can put it inside physical inventory. The third option is you can put it in an interface in stocking mode. And an item in interface in stocking mode is not visible to network storage. If you try to do a craft and you have an item in stocking mode and it's being stocked as you request the craft may break because the network storage doesn't understand where the item went between when it started the request and when it finished calculating the request. But in this case, we're using the storage bus. So when the proxy craft begins, the litmus paper is not in network storage. But in 64 to 128 ticks, the litmus paper is going to be returned, but only after the entire input to the recipe has been sent. And by patterning the oil cracking recipes as well as the distillation recipe, we're all recycling all the components. So this proxy craft technique is also used to push lots of fluid very quickly because there is no limit to how much items and fluids you can push through an interface if it's patterned, assuming there is enough storage for the item. So if you're running Eye of Harmony and you need to push a lot of fluid, what you do is you pattern a huge amount of fluid and you send it and you have the same proxy setup. But instead of using like heavy fuel, light fuel recycling, using lots of other fluids. So that's the full setup for high octane gasoline. And this was with unfilled cells. So with unfilled cells, we have one central buffer of cells that's shared between all the lanes. And as a result, if we craft and we have, let's say we want to do a lot of cracking, and we have a lot of cells that are sent for cracking, they'll all sit in the buffer chest, and those cells might be taken from the brown subnet. So let's say we do a lot of cracking and then we do a little bit of LCR work, and the LCRs might not fill at the same rate that the oil cracking unit cells refill, because oil cracking ate all the cells, they're all sitting in the buffer. So the practical effect of having this shared unfilled cells is that sometimes if I have a long buffer, it'll be useful to know that I have a long buffer, but it'll also block crafts from other machines that might be able to run. Now you won't get this problem if you don't share cells unfilled across the same subnet for different machines. So if I had a separate brown subnet for oil cracking units, I wouldn't have this problem. A second problem you might have with unfilled cells is you might run out of the non-consumable. So let's say if I take a cell, an empty cell is inserted always into the bottom drive first. Then this one is the second highest priority, and so on. So let's say this one is a config 1 circuit. Let's say I do 50 crafts which use a config 1 circuit. And I have a buffer that only has 30 of the non-consumable. Now there are 10 cells in here that'll get filled, and another 20 that will get filled, but then the 20 cells after that will not get the non-consumable. So it's important to have lots of non-consumables sets if you want to do this method. But this method lets you see the queue. Not only can you see in the crafting menu what the queue status is, what is requested, but you can actually see what is the bottleneck for your system if you do it this way. So if you see a lot of cells or waiting on the oil cracking, then you know that oil cracking is the bottleneck without looking at the crafting plan. That can save a lot of time. So this is Cray and I's survival world. So we're running with nuclear, and we've got nukes filled with uranium, and they're making lots of energy when we need it. I've got an energy indicator here, and of course the special thing is these large chemical reactors. They're set up in a way, I space them out so that when I can upgrade to mega chemical reactors, I don't need to move the automation setup, which I think will save a lot of time. And so let's say, let's see what we can craft. So I think we're waiting on one craft. Let's see if we can make some platinum. Okay, and now let's watch them in action. So if I click on one, so crafting ammonia, and right after that, let's see if it switches. It didn't switch, but it also didn't stop. It didn't turn off. And this one's crafting ammonia. We're crafting a lot. Flatline needs a lot of ammonia, so that's understandable. So all of these are running on ammonia, it looks like. As soon as they switch recipes, they will switch recipes. They'll run on something else too. So they've got 3 lights. The red one is the maintenance hatch. Oh, now running. Oh, still ammonia. Okay. One is the maintenance hatch. The light blue one indicates that there's items or fluids inside the input hatch and bus. And the purple one, the magenta one, is an activity detector cover, and that's inverted machine idle state. So this one turns on when the machine reports that it's running. It's not always like it's flickering. I think the flickering is kind of cool, but it is like it's not actually turning off when it does that. And we can see, oh, it's running on acetone now. And oh, it didn't have to stop. It continued to run acetone. Actually, that might be because the pattern is larger, but now we see it's switching to nitric acid, and it's running nitric acid. And these are all using different config circuits. And it looks like all of them are finished. And if I go over to here, looks like it's waiting on the EBFs. So I haven't really expanded the EBFs much. Yeah, they look like they're off because they're out of power. So the LCRs were not the bottleneck there. They're running on 4 on IV amps, and it's the same setup that I showed earlier. So for the endpoint, we have a storage bus on a baby chest, item importing with more or less the same IC into the IO port, which extracts the cell's items. Then it gets crafted. When it finished crafts, this item importer gets a signal, and that item importer sends the cell into here, and it looks like they're back to crafting again. So crafting a little bit because the EBF's turned on. And then once that cell that contains the non-consumable is finished, it gets extracted by an unfiltered item conduit, which sends the cell all the way back to the drive it belongs in. So these cells, this is the SAMPS design. This is with pre-filled cells. And with pre-filled cells, I need less infrastructure. And I also don't need to worry about cells getting misplaced or non-consumables running out, because the non-consumable never exits the cell when it returns to the drive. So in this case, this is IC0. The cells are completely empty. And we have a item conduit. This item conduit is extracting to the red channel, and it's got a blacklist for the empty cell. And the way that you ghost the cell in is you favorite it, you bookmark it, and then you drag the bookmark into the filter. If you drag the cell directly into the filter, it will not work. So that's for the empty cells. And then for this one, these cells contain a config1 circuit. And this config1 circuit is ghosted in. You see it says 1 out of 63. That one item that's ghosted in is the config1 circuit. So when they're extracted into the red channel, they all go into this very small buffer, the 9-slot buffer of an interface connected on the Lime subnet. And if I open Network Visualization Tool, we can see this Lime subnet only has 5 channels. It's got that one interface and 4 storage buses on these baby chests. So what happens is we have some interfaces here. So these 2 interfaces on the cyan subnet, and the cyan subnet just pushes the items inside the cell. Then the item conduits take the cell out, send it to the endpoints. So this has blocking mode and config 0, and this interface on the cyan subnet side has the advanced blocking card. And in this case, it's the default blocking mode. So this works for most of the combinations, but there is one recipe in GTNH which this doesn't work for, and that recipe, I think it's acetone. That's acetone. So acetone you can make with isopropyl benzene, but you can also make it using acetic acid and quicklime. And quicklime is a non-consumable. But unfortunately, the person who wrote the advanced blocking card didn't set a manual override. So I can't manually override what is set on the blocking mode. So if I change this blocking mode to loose mode, I don't get to choose which items are on the exception. The only exception is circuits and lenses, but they didn't add quicklime. So the problem is I want to insert the contents of the cell and I want to use quicklime as non-consumable. So these cells only contain the config 24 circuit, but when they are pushed, when the item's ready to craft, the cell is extracted and it's sent into this I/O port. And this I/O port is the same as the unfilled cell filler that we saw earlier. It's just a small version. This I/O port extracts from network storage into the cell, transfer when work is done. And this is stocking from a brown subnet, which contains some quicklime, which is stocking mode stored on an interface, one at a time. And with this setup, it's important that there aren't more than 6 cells in the drive, because let's say if I have 7 cells and I push all 7, and let's say that all the LCRs are full and the buffer's full. So let's say I have six cells which have been requested to craft, and those 6 cells are all sitting in the 6 output slots, and they can't move to the buffer because the buffer's full and the LCR is busy. Now I have a 7 cell which comes over here and says, I want some more items. Now, if those cells aren't leaving the buffer, then the 7 cell won't get the item. These other cells will. So it's important that we don't put more than 6 cells in this particular one. But if we wanted to do more than 6 cells, then we would probably just have to repeat this setup and maybe like add a second drive connected to a second I/O port, and we can push into those and have separate filter channels that deposit the cells in. So it's a bit of extra work due to like a bit of an oversight with the blocking card implementation, but overall it does work quite nicely, and you can see they're still crafting. And I think that usually with Platline, the bottleneck is the LCRs. The same with all the chemical processing lines. And it looks like, oh yeah, we finished most of the platinum, and yeah, bottlenecks on the UBF. But this line, what I have here, this thing crafts everything for me. It crafts Platline with iridium, osmium, palladium. It also crafts monazite. It also crafts circuits. So I have on here a mainnet interface. This is my main network, and it has an interface which is touching the cyan subnet, which will push config 0. And this one is crafting different wafers for circuits. And the way that I have this same LCR set work for both is that I have a storage bus here on the LCR network, and this storage bus pushes the output into the mainnet. So I've also got, over here I have a shared network storage. So these super chests and the super tanks as well, but I haven't really needed to use those. The super chests share the network storage. So this way I have raw silicon, and it's stored in mainnet, and it's stored in the subnet. And both of the storage buses have a very high priority because I always want items to go in here. And so the idea behind these super chests is I don't have to expose the entire network storage from one subnet to the other. If I expose the entire network storage from the fluid subnet to the mainnet, then I have something which pulls items here, like platinum metallic powder dust. I never want to have that in mainnet. It always belongs in the subnet. But if I have network storage, this will constantly loop. So I don't want that. And if I have a storage bus which the subnet can see all of my network storage, then we have a big problem, because the whole appeal of this setup is that I can set a level maintainer to automatically craft the thing I want. And the level maintainer, it calculates a crafting plan the same way that I would when I requested the platinum. The problem is the crafting plan takes longer to calculate if there are more items of fluid stored in the network. So we don't want to store anything more than we need. And on my main network, I have multiple drives just filled with random items, and it does slow down the crafting plan a lot. And if you do that enough, you get TPS issues. So the idea is we only want stuff that we actually craft on the subnet. And that's why it's important to have this shared storage, because this way I can access the raw silicon from both sides, and then I can craft solar grade silicon inside the subnet, and mainnet can see it, but it doesn't need to craft it because it's just passively stocked. And for now, I can passively stock at 2000, but if I need more, then I can set the stocking rate higher. And if I want to make some now, I should be able to just put in the request. Oh, I need a lot of chlorine. Let's do a bit less. And I think it should wear straight into action, because that solar grade silicon only is LCRs. And normally, that's the kind of automation you could do with just two single block chemical reactors. But this LCR recipe, it's very fast. And if I look at the pattern, it already finished in less than like 10 seconds. So this setup is very, very fast, and the chemical reactors do everything. So if I want to scale this up, I can build more chemical reactors, or I can change the hatches. And let's say I'm running low on energy, but I don't want to turn all my chem off. What I can do is just hit this toggle bus, and now these two chemical reactors will not get cells sent into the baby chest. So they won't have crafts turned off, and I'm not using the machine controller cover. I'm just not depositing items in there. And now only these two are crafting, and these two don't use any power. So what I can have is, let's say I have my LSC has a power indicator. I send that on wireless redstone, and let's say I'm running low on power. I just turn most of the LCRs off. Now that's pretty convenient. So it's purely scalable. I don't need higher tier energy hatches, because like let's say I'm in LUV, but I want to scale these up. I want to run them at around 4 amps CPM. And I can't do it because I don't have the energy hatches to do it. But what I can do is I can just build more LCRs and have it be modular. So in the past, there have been people who have tried to do universal LCR setups using one reactor, and it's pretty fast. You can do it with circuit priorities. You don't need to use non-consumables. You don't need to non-consumable hot swap. You don't need to take it in and out of the cell. If you're just very smart about the order. I tried it myself, and I found it very unreliable. I think it can work, but this approach is more scalable, and you're never going to get recipe conflicts with this approach. That's the main appeal, that all the LCRs run all the time whenever they're needed, and as much as you want. If you don't want to run some, you don't have to. So the other setup I have, which is universal for this single player playthrough, which has made our base progress very fast, is assemblers. So assemblers are the bottleneck for a lot of recipes through HV to IV, because if you want the assembling multi-blocks, there are two assembling multi-blocks. There is a large-scale auto-assembler and the precise auto-assembler. And both of these you need ZPM to make. You don't need ZPM to make the controller, but you need ZPM to make the casings. These MK1 casings are very expensive, and there's a change that's being proposed with the removal of processing arrays that there'll be a down-tiered version of these precise casings. Now, I think this is a really bad change because it disincentivizes using processing arrays. Like processing arrays are a really unique purpose, but you can only make them in mid to late IV because they need a lot of tungsten steel. This is a setup you can make in mid EV. You don't need any tungsten steel to make this. And what's good about it is it uses single blocks. So I've never seen someone before use single blocks for a universal setup. Let's say I want to make some fences. So if I want to make a fence, if I want to make an assembler, I need a config3 circuit and some sticks. Now, what this setup does is it has unfilled cells. So these cells are all empty. And it has a self filler. This IO port is stocking from network storage into the cell. And it has a stocking mode interface with the config circuit. That cell goes into this buffer chest. When there is a cell in this buffer chest and there is no item currently inside the storage bus on the assembler we're connected to, and there is no cell inside the IO port, this logic is determined by the AND gates, then we're going to pull a cell with the item importer into this IO port. This IO port is going to deposit the cell contents into network storage and only finish when the cell's empty. This network storage, all the way over here, is going to store everything on the storage bus. That includes the fluids. The fluid packets are items, not fluids. So then that's going to orange subnet. And what I have here is some timing control. So this is a circuit which activates one of these inverted toggle buses and it cycles through them every time I give a redstone pulse. So if I turn this lever on, you can see at any one time, only one of the inverted toggle buses is on and it cycles through them all. So there's two ways to do this. One is I can have a global clock like this timer. The other way is I can have activity-based detection. So what I have here is a pulse former connected to a P2P tunnel, a redstone P2P tunnel. That redstone P2P tunnel is connected to this one. So it's actually, I don't need two pulse formers here, but so what this one does is every time an item is moved into this IO ports, this gets a redstone signal and moves ahead to the next assembler. And so what does this network do? When it has the cell, what it does is very similar to the multi-blocks before. So there's a storage bus that stores the items inside this assembling machine. There is a fluid storage bus, which are the fluids inside it. And then I have an interface over here, which reports the contents of the assembler to the green net, which I'll talk about later. And then we have a storage bus, which has, like before, fuzzy card, fluid packet. And this storage bus doesn't need that. Because we only have one fluid for any assembler recipe, we don't need to worry about two fluid packets getting stuck. So we don't need an inverter card in the other item storage bus. And this fluid packet decoder sends the fluid into the assembler. You might be wondering which direction this assembler is facing. It's facing this way. And the reason I know that is because there is a formation plane here. This formation plane places the assembler. It has a filter set. This is an MBT specific filter too. So this filter contains an assembling machine with an activity detector cover on the top. If it has an assembling machine that doesn't have the detector cover, it's not going to place it. Formation planes work like a fourth kind of network storage. Compared to stocking mode interfaces, storage buses, and drives, they do store items in an insert only. You can't extract from a formation plane. Likewise, annihilation planes kind of work like network storage. They don't have a config though. Annihilation planes, you might be wondering, there's an annihilation plane on the same subnet as a formation plane. They're connected. But the formation plane is not, if I turn on a lever, the annihilation plane and the formation plane will constantly destroy this assembling machine and replace it. And it has a pretty cool graphical effect. But the reason they're not doing that is the annihilation plane only destroys the item if there is an unfiltered network storage location it could store the item. So there's a toggle bus here. This toggle bus activates whenever the machine finishes a craft. That's what this redstone logic does. So every time the machine finishes a craft, this pulse form activates, sending a signal to this counter. This counter steps up to 2 signals. So every 2 times a pulse happens here, a signal gets sent to this counter. I'll turn it on. I'll make a craft for some fences. So any second now, once the wood shows up, we'll see some cells come into this chest, and they will get sent into assemblers. And now we know that they're on. And so this red yellow wire, if this is off, the machine is currently crafting. So this one is currently crafting fences. And as soon as it finished crafting the fences, the assembly machine is going to get destroyed and immediately replaced. It's going to destroy because this toggle bus is going to turn on. So this redstone logic is going to turn on any second now. And so it sends 2 signals, and it flashes this red yellow wire, which flashes this toggle bus. It's not 1 tick exactly, but it's a very short amount of time. And when this toggle bus turns on, the blue subnet is connected to the lime subnet, and the lime subnet has an unfilled storage bus. Now, this unfiltered storage bus, this one is an inverter card with fluid packets. Just make sure the fluid packets never enter in here. But this one is a low priority. This one's priority 0. But the formation plane has a higher priority. Now, it's also priority 0, but when you have a choice between different kinds of storage, A2 will always choose the filtered storage as high priority if there's a tie. So even though they have the same priority number, this formation plane has a higher priority. So the annihilation plane only destroys items if there is unfiltered network storage capacity available. But it doesn't mean it'll store the item there. It just means it'll destroy the block. And this is the technique that I abuse to make the system work. So right now, yeah, we have, I think I finished the craft actually. Yeah, finished the craft, 100 fences. I'll put in another 100. So the idea is every time we set an assembler to craft, we're going to send a signal to this redstone. This AND gate is going to look at the, so each module here is just making sure that only one of these inverted toggle bus is active at a time. And every time it cycles through, the AND gate is checking, was there a pulse from the global signal? And is my toggle bus currently active? If yes, turn my one off and turn the next one on. That's all this does. It just looks a bit intimidating, but that's all it does. And yeah, so right now all 4 of them are crafting. Well, that one's not crafting, but this one's crafting, this one's crafting, this one's crafting because the red yellow wire is off. You can see, oh, it's making fences. This one's making fences. So this setup's good because when you overclock a recipe, you get 2 times the speed, but you have to pay 4 times the energy overall. So overall, the energy cost doubles. But a lot of recipes, most recipes in EV and IV only use EV assemblers. So like fences is a pretty slow recipe. It doesn't use that much energy. But if I overclock it, then I'm using a lot of energy. And also, the high tier assembling machines are expensive. You know, if I want to look at the EV one, I need 2 robot arms. I need 2 workstations. And if you're early EV, that might not be easy. Before you have quantum processors, if you're stuck with nanocircuits, it could be a while till you can span them. So you know, if you're doing this in HV, even though you have titanium, you know, that's what we did, and then that's at EV, and maybe we'll scale up to IV. But we're at the point where we can afford processing arrays, and processing arrays greatly simplify this because you don't need this redstone control. You don't need any of this. You don't need any of that. All you need is the cell shuffling. So processing arrays simplify it a lot. But this is still very strong before you can make processing arrays. So this green subnet, all this one does is if there is any item in any of the assemblers, there's a level emitter which turns on. and then it says it's crafting. This is a useful indicator to show that an item is currently being buffered and waiting to craft, or that a jam occurred, because the system can jam. There are a few edge cases. So one of the edge cases is you want to craft an item which has more than 64 items in the output. And a good example of this is the SMDs. So if I want to make SMD transistor, you know, I might want to scale this recipe up. I might want to do more than one stack at a time, but I can't. Not with this setup. You might think, oh well, I could scale it up, and what I'll do is I'll have an I/O port, and this cell's going to constantly move between both of these I/O ports. So it's going to extract the cell contents into network storage. It's going to extract network storage into the cell. So in other words, it's going to take the output slot of the assemblers by accessing the storage bus interface junction and deposit it into the I/O ports, then take that item back and put it into the line network and repeat the process. Because if I don't do that and I craft one stack of a SMD, the machine will stop crafting because the output is full. An assembly machine doesn't keep crafting if the output slot is full. So I could extract it using the storage buses, but there's a problem. You know, I can only extract using automated network storage using an I/O port if I have the machine output bus facing the storage bus. And if I have the outputs facing the storage bus, I can't insert into the output face using the same storage bus unless I have a screwdriver and I set the feature which is input from output side allowed. Now the problem with this is this input from output side allowed is not remembered when you break and replace the item. So when the formation plane replaces the assembling machine, it forgets about that setting. And we're already using all 6 faces of the assembling machine. One side is for power. One side is for redstone for the activity detector cover. One side is for the formation plane. One side is for the annihilation. Oh, and the formation plane, the machine always faces the front of the formation plane when it's placed. One side is for the annihilation plane. One side's for the storage bus. One side's for the fluid storage bus. In total, all 6 faces of the machine get used. So if we use a transvector, we can face the transvector towards where the output bus might be, the output face. But my testing, I found it to be a bit unpredictable. It's kind of random. So I don't think it's worth the effort. It's better to just keep the recipe sizes down below 1 stack, which means that for a fast recipe, you might have a problem. So the second problem with this setup is the activity detector cover is a bit slow. It's about the same speed as the fluid and ion detector cover, but for the large chemical reactors, they don't turn on until the fluid detector cover is activated. With these setups, they will turn on as soon as the items are inserted. And the big difference there is if the item crafts in about 10 ticks or less, this pulse former will not get a signal when it finishes because the detector cover doesn't update quickly enough. So in other words, if you have a short craft, it can jam because the item doesn't get pulled out. It gets stuck in the output slot. Then you have another item inserted. It's not crafting because there's something in the output slot. So it doesn't always work. And yeah, I think that's those are the 2 main edge cases. I've experimented a lot with the redstone here. This is just one design. I think there are lots of designs you could do. But the main disadvantage with this setup is the switching time. So the time between switching is pretty slow. It's slow because we need to make sure, we need to rely on this level limiter basically. This level limiter says, is the assembler that we're looking at, does it contain items? Because if it does, we don't want to switch. We don't want to deposit 2 non-consumable sets to the same assembler. So it's very important that we wait until depositing based on this level limiter. And this level limiter takes about 10 ticks to update, which is why this is set to 1 second. So that there's always going to be a window that it can take longer. I found it can take up to about 1.9 seconds for the level limiter to update, which is why, well, 0.9 seconds, which is why I have to set this to 1 second. But if I could, I would set this to a lower interval, which would increase the switching time. And the other problem with activity-based detection for the switching is, let's say I have some graphene crafting, and graphene takes a long time to craft. It takes 160 seconds. Let's say one of these assembles I got graphene, and then I've got 3 fences, and then I want to craft another graphene. So this assembly is filled with graphene. This one is a fence. Those 3 have a fence. This one finishes, and then the current inverted toggle bus is now back to this one. But this one it's still crafting, so it's not going to accept an item. And the problem with that is for those 150 seconds, maybe, let's say the other 3 finish in 10 seconds. For 150 seconds, all the other 3 assemblers are not going to be on. So that's a drawback of this approach. If you have like lots of recipes with different durations, it can get bottlenecked on the long one. And the way to compensate for this, I think, is to have this like a hybrid approach. So you have activity detection, and maybe every like 10 seconds or so, you have a timer here, which also switches the channel. I haven't tested this though. I'm not 100% sure it will work reliably. I've tried this setup a few different ways, and this has been something I'm working on a long time. This is like one of the prototypes. Sometimes I have the counter, the maximum value sometimes needed to be 5, but I found it's a bit unpredictable. I usually just decide what it is when I build it and see what the assembly machine does. There are a few different ways to do the switching. This is a method that I use in 1.12. This works flawlessly in 1.12, but in this version of A, it doesn't work. So what this is I have a storage bus which reports inaccessible items, and I have a level emitter set to report when there is 1 or more items. And I have an inverted toggle bus and a normal toggle bus. So what this is meant to do is if there's an item in here, then this inverted toggle bus will turn off and this one will turn on. So all the inverted toggle buses are on at the start, but all the toggle buses are off at the start. So I insert items into this orange net, and then there's an item that goes in here. So right now, if I send an item from an interface, in here, it'll go inside this assembler. Then what's meant to happen is this level emitter is meant to turn on, then the next item packet will get sent to this assembler, but it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is due to an A bug in 1710. So you see, when I inserted this item, the network powered down, even though there is an energy cell right next to it. And if I use a network viz tool, we can see the channels are not updating. And if I take the item out, the network turns back on. Now, if I put item in here, I might have the same problem. Maybe. It's very unpredictable. So nope, that level emitter works. If I put item back in here, that one turns off. Now let's say I take off this power cell and add some quartz fiber. Now that's interesting. So these 2 are off, but they're still passing power through to the 3rd subnet. So this is a bug. The bug is due to when you have a level emitter next to a toggle bus. So if you don't put level emitters next to toggle bus, this bug doesn't happen. So this is another example of if I space it out, if I use 2 level emitters but toggle bus on separate blocks, the bug still happens. This is a design where I separated the level emitter from the toggle bus, just putting a repeater in the middle. But we'll see if I put an item inside. It's very strange what it does. It took about 2 seconds to switch. And sometimes this repeater will flicker on and off. So the level emitter will report the wrong item state. I have this set up to a small crafting CPU to make some fences. So if I put some sticks inside here, and I try to make 100 fences, in theory, all of these should turn on parallel. But when I turn them on at once, initially all 5 turn on, and then only one's on. And then we have that. So the second bug is the network recalculation is just not very good with toggle buses. There's the flickering of the repeaters. And it does settle itself eventually, but you can see it's designed to be parallel with 8 machines. But even in the best case, we only ever had 5 turn on. And in practice, it's more like only 3 or 4 ever on at a time. Even though we can deposit items into this assembler, it just doesn't work.